Hello, this is your host Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Logos and I are returning to our discussion of the church fathers in general, but the Ignatian epistles in particular. And we are now at our last Ignatian epistle, the other 8 being at this point in history already rejected as spurious. And I had said in an earlier episode we were going to cover the martyrdom of Ignatius, but that was my bad. That's actually one of the spurious accounts, which we're not going to get into. So we will not be reading the martyrdom of Ignatius. So, beginning with the letter to Polycarp. Now, it bears in mind that Polycarp is the bishop of Smyrna. So, this letter is it would seem to be kind of redundant because he wrote a letter to the Smyrnians. In fact, to the bishop of the Smyrnians, which is Polycarp. So it's like this is kind of interesting. But be that as it may, this one is also one of the 3 letters that has a Syrian version as well, which again seems to be fairly similar to the Greek ones, at least in this case. So with the first one, basic introductions, Ignatius greets Polycarp, Bishop of Smyrna, in the name of the Father and the Son. We go on to chapter 1, and we see that. Let's see here. Yeah, Polycarp. He praises Polycarp for having his mind fixed on God as upon a rock. Ignatius entreats him to exhort all to be saved. Unity is to be preserved as the main thing. Be long-suffering, pray without ceasing, be a perfect athlete for Christ. In the long version, it's the same, more or less. In the Syrian version, we also see, ask for understanding, for the struggle is long and painful. Chapter 2. Let's see here. There we go. Let's just make this a little bit bigger here. There we go. Chapter 2. We see no reward is given for loving the disciples. The baseline, one ought to be meek. This seems to be directed at what Jesus said when he said, if you do all that is expected of you, you're unprofitable slaves. You're not even going to get any kudos for that. Different injuries require different treatments. One size does not fit all. Be wise as serpents, but harmless as doves. Pray that God will give wisdom so that you would not be unprofitable in good works. Be the pilot that leads the church through the troubled waters, and be an athlete of God to achieve the prize of immortality. The long version is the same. Syrian version seems to have this difference: seek that which is incorruptible. Okay, chapter 3. Avoid teachers of new doctrines. Stand firm. Compete as an athlete for Christ to win the prize. Focus on the one who is invisible to overcome sin in the world. The long version includes focus on Christ. Christ was tempted in all things as we are, being in the flesh but sinless. And then in the Syrian, he says, discern the times. Chapter 4. Do not neglect widows. Do nothing without the consent of the bishop. Meet frequently. Do not despise male or female servants, nor let them be puffed up with pride. Teach them to submit to God in all humility. Do not use the church funds to free them, lest they become slaves to passion. Now that does seem kind of odd that he would have this idea that the church fund should not be used to free slaves, presuming that these slaves are themselves Christians. One of the things that Christians have commonly done, for example, in later centuries, St. Patrick would free slaves with church funds. There must be there might be some context here that's missing, which otherwise makes it somewhat strange that he would say that. So I don't exactly know what's going on there. So is there anything you want to add on that point before we keep going, Logos?
No, it seems kind of strange to me. I mean, doesn't the Bible explicitly say something like, there's no male, female, slave, free man, we're all like one in Christ or whatever? And so it seems like, given that, if you could free other Christians who are slaves, you'd kind of do so to kind of bring them into the fold. This is especially interesting because, right, you can't serve 2 masters. And so if you're a slave on earth and you're compelled to do your master's bidding, and your master compels you to do something unchristlike, that could be a conflict of interest. And so you'd think that Christians would want to get people out from slavery just to lessen the chances that outside forces could tempt or compel them to do something, say, the church or Christ wouldn't want them to do. I don't know.
Well, exactly. And this is also in a time before you had you had authority figures who owned large amounts of slaves being Christian, which could then put leverage on the church to say, "Hey, leave me alone. Let me make money over here." This is before that time. This is before Constantine. So it is strange that we would see this. Okay, chapter 5. Flee the deeds of evil. Tell Christian women to be content with their husbands, for husbands to love their wives as Christ loved the church. If anyone can remain celibate, let them, but without pride, for pride will undo them. Men and women who seek to marry must do so with the bishop's consent, so as not to be motivated by lust. And there's no significant difference in the longer Syrian versions. Chapter 6. Give heed to the bishop, so that God may give heed to you. Be submissive to the bishop, presbyters, and deacons. Labor together in community for God. Please the one you fight for, and the one who pays you. Please God. So, right, you're fighting for God. God pays you. Be not a deserter. Serve God with distinction. And then Syrian, we see the addition of let your baptism be as an armor, faith as a spear, love as a helmet, and patience as your panoply. Yeah, okay. So you've had something to say on chapter 6, Logo. So let's start unpacking it here.
Well, now I missed a part of chapter 5 when I first looked at chapter 6. Now I've got even more to say on chapter 6, right?
Okay, well, let's go back to chapter 5 first. What did you miss here?
Yeah. Where is it? I heard you say it, but I gotta find it again. Here it is. Yeah, to form their union with approval of the bishop. The bishop, the bishop, the bishop. It seems like in chapter 5, they're referring to the bishop as like your local pastor, in the sense that like your church, your community should okay the marriage and make sure it's done on good pretenses and so on. But if you look at chapter 6, how it's used, it's the bishop is used again, right? Now this is really interesting because who's this letter addressed to? This letter is addressed to Polycarp, who's a bishop.
Yes.
So he's telling a bishop to give heed to the bishop. So is he telling him to give heed to himself, or is he talking about Christ? I think it's obvious if you look at the very beginning of the letter and who things are addressed to. Christ is referred to the bishop also at the beginning of this letter, and maybe the beginning of others. I might have missed it. So the only way this makes sense is if he's telling Polycarp to give heed to Christ as the bishop. But then if you look at the previous one in chapter 5, right? Get Christ's approval before you get married. Well, anybody could say they've got Christ's approval. What's the mechanism to ensure you've got Christ's approval? What ostensibly it'd be like the local church. Like that's the entire point is the community has to accept the marriage. And so I'm seeing two different senses of the bishop being used back to back here that can't possibly be the same thing. But it gets so now thinking about these letters, everything we've been talking about, right? So going all the way back to the beginning here, you said that you're talking to people who are using the letters of Ignatius to argue for like an early church father tradition of like stronger church hierarchy. And so the idea here is like the bishop is meaning like the local like bishop. But I mean, let's go through all the ways that got weird as we worked our way through the letters, right? So why were there all these differences in letters? Well, ostensibly these differences occurred because they're trying to tell people like different regions have different problems. Some with Judaizers, some with Gnostics, some with other heresies, and some with like money and pride. And so each letter had these like little differences, and they're lecturing or admonishing these communities to deal with these problems as they see them. Okay, but almost all these letters make some comment about the bishop and how you're supposed to obey the bishop and adhere to the bishop. Well, the first dilemma we posited was if the bishop is referring to like the physical pastor or whatever in the community, like the guidepost for that community, then all these communities must have had problems obeying the bishop in this way, in which case it can't be some broader tradition. It's something he's trying to change. Now, if there aren't these problems that they're really trying to solve, then what he's saying is some like truism, like obey the bishop in like some sort of like truistic way where Christ is the bishop. And that's the only way, especially in light of him sending this letter to Polycarp, a bishop, I can think of this, right? Is it seems like there's some pretenses where he's using the bishop as like the physical thing, marriage, and some where he's using it like the symbolic thing. And it seems like anybody who's trying to make this argument that Ignatius is arguing for some like higher level of church authority here is allowing for a lot of subtle equivocation on this the bishop symbol, when it's really not supposed to be that way. And trying to make it out to be that way is just causing a whole bunch of problems, like putting all of this together.
Well, there is an earlier letter we discussed where he also said that Antioch, after his arrest, was without a bishop. And furthermore, in the last letter to the Smyrnians, where he says that Polycarp, right, he's the bishop of Smyrna, should elect somebody to go to Antioch. So does that mean that that's the new bishop of Antioch? And who's doing the electing? Because presumably you can't have an election of just one. You just can't have Polycarp just choose them. It's going to have to be voted by the presbyters and deacons, in which case that's a weaker form of bishopal power. So yeah, what does that mean? You're right. There does seem to be an equivocation in the use of bishop, because again, give ye heed to the bishop that God may give heed to you. Well, he is the bishop. So it's like, how does that work? Now there is one thing that we have in 1 Peter 2:25, we read, "For you were as sheep going astray, but are now turned unto the shepherd and bishop of your souls, which is Christ." So there is some scriptural grounds for this kind of reading that you're talking about, Logos.
Yeah, I mean, there should be, because if you look at the very, very beginning of the letter and like the italicized writing, it actually said something about like talking about Christ as the bishop. So that's where I'm like, okay, so this whole thing could have been meaning like Christ was the bishop all along. But if that's the case, then it seems like any attempt to use these letters and taking these excerpts about like the bishop and what power the bishop should have, don't do anything without the bishop, and so on. Uh, any interpretation of that to be like a worldly church authority with a lot of power seems to be groundless, because you could never be sure whether he's talking about like a physical human bishop or if he's talking about just Christ symbolically and just saying, be a Christian basically. Um, I mean, it's made complicated because there are parts, I'd argue chapter 5, where he is talking about like a human bishop. But that problem is going to persist. And so I think the only way you could really resolve the issue is if you look at what his contemporary said and put it together. Like Polycarp, for example, right? Like just whenever somebody wants to take a passage and say, the bishop means a human bishop and look at how much power they got, or just say, well, look, Polycarp was a contemporary of the guy. What did Polycarp say? Do we have any like massive debates? I mean, we see massive debates with the early Christians and Gnostics and the early Christians and some pagans and other things. If there was this massive disagreement about how much power bishops should have, one would expect to see that debate in the historical record, given how much of a different position these people seem to take. And I mean, we're combing through these things in quasi chronological order. I'm not seeing it. Are you seeing it?
No, and the other thing too is if you read the Didache, when it talks about false doctrines, which is again the problem that Ignatius is dealing with here, it doesn't say just blindly trust the bishop. It says test them.
Yeah,
Well,
test them.
who's doing the testing? It's the congregation. The congregation has to have its wits about it themselves to actively test the teachers. Who the other thing too, that bit where he said that the emperor should obey the bishop, if that's a physical human bishop, that's an utterly nonsense thing to say at this time. Nobody's going to say that. And as you pointed out, if bishop means Christ, well then okay, then yeah, well that makes a lot more sense. In fact, that's the only way it could make sense, unless you want to say it was an interpolation.
Yeah, I mean, the emperor obey the bishop thing. It's like once Christ could be the bishop, and that's what it means. It's like, okay, that's just like a restatement to the every knee will bow clause, basically. And I think it was Revelations, right? I'm not sure.
Yes.
Um, yeah, everybody's going to confess, no matter how high up in the chain they are, that you are God and so on. It's like, okay, yeah, that if that's all he's saying, then that's what you'd expect a Christian to say. So there's nothing weird about that. But if every single instance of the bishop means actually some worldly bishop here on earth that should have a lot of power, then yeah, this thing gets weirder and weirder the more you look at the letters. And so it just seems like all along, way back when for the first letter, we should have just interpreted the bishop to be Christ, unless we have like good reason not to. And like say for chapter 5 in this one, where you're trying to get like permission for marriage. Christ, you can't just claim Christ gives you permission. Anybody could say that, right? So obviously the permission has got to be for somebody a little bit, more grounded than that. And if we would have just done that all along, a lot of these problems like wouldn't have popped up. But the reason we didn't do it all along is because you said that you got into arguments with like a lot of Eastern Orthodox and people who use these letters as an argument for some type of higher church authority position. And they said that the bishop could have been used in this way. So it's like, okay, let's take that on good faith. Let's just suppose the bishop is used in this way, and let's see what happens. And odder and odder, weirder things happen the further you go through the letters. That it's just it just got to be nonsense. So yeah, I mean, bishop just means Christ unless there's an obvious context where you're just using the bishop in terms of like communal permission to do something.
Well, exactly. And I went back to the introduction here, and he does, you're right, he does say, so Polycarp has his own bishop, God the Father, and Jesus Christ.
Exactly.
So, yeah. So there's a precedent for that association. And again, there's also in the letter itself, but also within Scripture itself, there's the precedent for the association. Okay, chapter 7. Ignatius seeks prayers from the faithful to the persecution to the so he can he seeks prayers from the faithful so that he may endure the persecution to the end and find the reward with God. Ignatius asked Polycarp to assemble a council to elect one from his congregation to go to Antioch. Oh, this is what I was talking about. I got ahead of things. Well, it's not clear what this guy's being elected for. Plausibly a bishop, because in an earlier letter he said there was no bishop in Antioch. Ignatius desires that this man may be grounded in the faith as is Polycarp, and exhorts Polycarp to continue in the love of Christ. In the Syrian version, he says that the Christian is not under his own power, but under God's. And let's see, where does he mention the election here? Yeah, it is fitting, O Polycarp, most blessed in God, for a very solemn council, and to assemble a very solemn council, and to elect one whom you greatly love and know to be a man of activity, who may be the designated messenger of God. Okay. Which I think messenger would be angel, right? And in the Greek angelos, and in Revelation, the bishops are called angels to the angels of the church each place. So it sounds like, given the way Ignatius talks and why there's certain scriptural metaphors you could use, he sounds like he's saying that Smyrna should elect the bishop for Antioch, which is interesting because who's doing the electing? It's not Polycarp. You can't have one guy vote. It's going to have to be. You could argue he's summoning a council of other bishops, but then that doesn't sound right because the way this chapter reads, it sounds like it's the Smyrnans themselves electing a replacement. What do you think, Logos?
I remember reading other letters before this one that they were also asking to send messengers to Antioch. I think one of the reasons why I send the letters out is because all the different churches are to send a delegate out there to help. I don't know, the way I'm seeing this is it's not so much that these outside churches are voting on the replacement directly. It's more like every outside church is kind of sending a member to kind of come in as a council to look, and they're looking through there you go. Let the other churches also send to Antioch, and I could have sworn I saw a previous letter that said something like that as well. And the idea seemed to me that the other churches are going to look through the community, and they're going to kind of work together with the community to kind of elect somebody in power, because it's like you have the outsider's view, and so you're not going to be beholden to like popularity contests and stuff. You don't know most of these people from Adam, so you don't care who the popular kid is. You've just got like the outsiders like judgment, like who seems to do well with people, who doesn't seem to backbite and gossip and whatever. And so the community will have their people, you'll observe, you'll have their people, you'll come together and discuss it, and then at the end there's like, okay, everybody's happy. You have our advice, you have your vote, you get your bishop, and we go home. Basically, is what it seemed to be describing to me.
Okay, this is the last chapter, chapter 8. Ignatius has not been able to write to all the churches. Okay, so this is something that I mentioned to you before earlier. He is in Troas, which is in Asia Minor, on the process of being sailed to Neapolis to then go to Rome to be martyred. And he says that's why he couldn't write to all the churches. Ignatius then salutes fellow Christians, the wife of Eutropius and her household and children, Attalus, let's see, Alcae, and then he prays for Polycarp. And yeah, so that's pretty much the Ignatian material that we have. Is there anything else that you want to say on this, Logos?
I'm happy it's over.
Yeah, I bet. One
There's
thing
just so
though,
much of it. Now, it's kind of interesting, but
so real quick, Vingel asks you, what does it mean that the congregation should test the bishop if the bishop is Christ?
yeah, this is where it gets weird, right? This is why there's like some equivocation on there between like the bishop is God and the bishop is a human. And you can't just assume the bishop has to mean one or the other. You know, like I said in chapter 5, it's very obvious the bishop has to be like a human being, because anybody can just say, oh, I prayed about it and Christ told me and this girl should totally get married, right? I got a feeling from Christ. Anybody could say that. Anybody. So obviously they have to be talking about something more than that in chapter 5. And when in the Didache, when they're talking about like test your bishops, test your teachers, they're obviously talking about the physical ones. But in other contexts, it's very clear that they're not talking about a physical person. They just can't be, given like the don't believe something unless the bishop says so. It's biblical law that you follow what the bishop says, the law of Christ, that you follow what the bishop says or whatever. It's like that's not quite biblical law unless you mean the bishop is God and you're just talking about like God's law, love your neighbor and all that, of course, right? So yeah, when they're testing the bishop, they have to be referring to like the physical person that wants to be your teacher. In other contexts, they have to mean something. Otherwise, it just doesn't make any sense. Otherwise, you're telling Polycarp to submit himself to the bishop, who's also a physical person, and he's the bishop. Who's he submitting to? He's already the bishop. It's weird.
Right, and of course, which if he's submitting to another bishop, that would entail there are multiple bishops in the city of Smyrna, which would then undercut the apologetic claim of Orthodox and Catholics. But then that begs the question, why does Ignatius use the singular? It's a real mess, right? So yeah, I agree. And yeah, so we're done with Ignatius. I think next time we're going to deal with Barnabas. And yep, this is Todd Lewis, the Praise of Flight podcast, signing off.